your top 10, numbers 7, 8, and 9, and don't worry, I'll remind you what they are in a minute. 7, 8, and 9 probably most closely linked to the work that I do, and we've touched on some of it already. But 7 is not asking, searching, and interesting questions. 8 is not listening to the answers, and then 9 is not recognizing the significance of the answers. So I think they kind of sit really nicely together. And I wondered if we can talk a little bit about that. What do you think is happening most often then? What do you see as the kind of the challenges? Why are they on your list?
Yeah, so I guess the first one, number 7, is probably the most common because no one's really thought about their process. They haven't got a list of interesting questions to work from, or they're too embarrassed to put it on the table. I always tell this in my training, I'm going to have that list smack on the table in front of me and the client. The heading at the top is going to be in the biggest font ever in the history of the universe, and it's going to say, my list of interesting questions. And if the client looks over and goes, what's that? I'm just going to laugh and go, mate, it's my list of interesting questions. And then I'm just going to get into it. And by the end, the client's going to be laughing too, going, mate, these questions are great. And now we've got a connection. I'm not going to try and memorize them. I can't do that. So that's the first thing. So I think the first mistake is people are not even doing that. But when they do, I've done role plays. Now, again, probably in a role play where this is a new skill, this is exactly what you would expect to happen. But because they're so focused on asking the question, they're not really listening to what's coming back. That happens the first few times, but it passes very quickly. That's just because you're doing something new, your brain's full of the new. That will pass after 3 or 4 goes at that. But you've got to be listening. And then the third one that ties into that, I've heard when clients explain what's important to them, it can be subtle and soft, but very important. And I think I used the example, Julie Lord told me this years ago, that she'd met a lawyer in London who, this is the short version, but when she was talking about what did he want to do with his life, she asked him these cool questions. He sort of mentioned that he'd quite like to move to the coast and write a book. But he didn't stand on the table shaking his fist going, I must do this before I die. It was just something that came up in the conversation. And so she was a great advisor. She picks up on that and said, so what's stopping you? Like, this is the short version of their conversation. What's stopping you? And he's saying, well, I can't. And she's going like, why not? And that was her basically saying, look, I can show you in a cash flow model that you could do this tomorrow. So now what's stopping you? And that's the nuance and subtlety of listening to that. Yeah, a lot of advisors would hear the lawyer mention that as a thing, not give it the attention it needed to unpick, and perhaps would have let them work another 5 years in their crappy law career. So that's that sort of stuff. What people want to do can be soft and subtle, which is why your work, where we're really listening to people, I just think is so important.
And you're right that it really does take practice to get out of your own head, and that's so much like it's all of day one really of most of the programs that I run. It's about listening to listen. You're not listening to reply. You're not listening to form your own next amazing, interesting question. You're listening to really listen and trust yourself that actually if you do that when the other person's finished, you'll come up with the next thing to say because you've been listening, because you remain curious, because you're deeply interested in the human being that's in front of you, which, let's face it, that's the reason most people are doing a financial planning job, because they're interested in people and they want to help.
Yeah, and every financial planner I know tells me, it doesn't matter how long they've been doing it, that they love that. That's the thrill of the job, being able to change people's lives in some way. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's little, sometimes it's in between, but that's the job, isn't it, when this is done well. And clients, I think, are so appreciative because I don't believe they get this. Like, their chances of picking one of the advisors we know and love, that the proper financial planning cohort, the chances of picking that randomly out of the phone book are slim. Yeah. And so when they do trip over or they get referred by a friend or whatever, I just think people love it. And that's the thrill for the advisor, to have that experience where you can see people are really into what you're providing. That's just still the thrill of the job for me after all these years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when when you're not listening really well, you can miss so much. I think, whether it's dreams and aspirations, or whether it's actually vulnerabilities as well. That's a pretty hot topic, isn't it? I've definitely seen that happen when I remember I was told a story, actually. I think it might have been on one of my recent courses, and it was an observation made by one of the planners about somebody else that they'd kind of seen in action. A client had started opening up about, I can't remember what the situation was. It was something like having I think it was an adult son maybe back at home and unable to work, and was really struggling, and actually the way that it was dealt with was okay, back to the cash flow. So there was a real lack of comfort with emotion that was being shown, or whether it was missing what was said, or whether it was being uncomfortable and not really wanting to open up a big emotional can of worms in a financial planning meeting, or whatever it was. But that was huge to that client, and something that really was it really did impact their financial planning. And so this was the observation that was being made, like that should have been picked up on and given more space.
Yeah, and like you think about it, like therapists probably have to go and do 5 years of therapy before they're allowed to practice. Coaches have to go and do their own coaching and be the recipient before they're allowed to go and coach. And there's a reason for that. This all starts with you. You got to work on yourself, and it doesn't matter what role you're in. That's the starting point. But yes, if you're going to be let rip on the general public, man, you're going to have to do some work on yourself so that those things don't happen. And don't get me wrong, we've probably all done that in our career. Like these are mistakes we make. But we want to recognize that after maybe an hour after the meeting, you think, oh, gee whiz, I could have handled that differently. Great. There's a work on. There's something to go and dive into to make yourself better for next time.
Yeah, definitely. Something that my coach does that's been a takeaway for me. She, when she works with me or any of her clients, she has 2 columns on her notepad, and she'll make any notes on the left-hand side that's about me or what I say. And anything that comes up for her, she'll note on the right-hand side, so that she's aware of that and can take it away, or, that was a bit reactive of me, or, I didn't want to hear that. So whatever it might be. And obviously she's been doing the job a long time and she's very, very self-aware. But I think you're right, that kind of work is so important, whether it's that kind of getting comfortable with emotions and doing that sort of work, or actually just getting comfortable with silence, because most of us aren't. That's why we jump into a conversation. It's because we can't bear the silence. It's not because the other person's probably doing some really deep, great thinking while they're staring out the window. Let's leave them to it, let them get on with it.
And Rebecca, I have a question for you. Like in the programs you've run this year, like what are you seeing? And I know you've done lots of work with different firms. What are you seeing? Like when you work in this space, working on the skills of advisors, what's the big stuff for you that you notice?
Well, I mean, it's big stuff, but it's the simple stuff. It's not easy, but it's relatively simple. Getting comfortable with silence, not jumping into that pause, because where there's a pause in the conversation, that's where we're used to jumping in and getting our turn. Learning to listen without having that expected need to reply, being comfortable asking, well, what more do you want to say about that? And really getting the other person to dig in. And I think the other big thing is realizing that the client is the best person to solve. They're the expert on them, and actually they're probably the best person to solve some of these issues for themselves. Yes, you're the expert on the financial product solutions, whatever it is that's going to financially enable them to live the life that they want to live, but you're with them for maybe 2 hours in their whole year. There's so much else that's going on. So I think that positioning the client as the expert on them, and you're the expert on the financial side of things, and that's why they've come to see you. But that really realizing that and not jumping in too soon to fix a problem that might seem to be what's presenting itself, or you might have seen that with 10 other clients in the past. Let's not assume that that's the case with this person. Let's not assume that that's going to be the solution here. I was absolutely delighted to welcome Ruth Sturkey onto one of my recent courses, and she, you might have seen her blog, but in her most recent blog, she wrote about her experience, and she said something like, when she was listening in this way that I teach, I could see the humanity, intelligence, and emotions of the person in front of me. And I mean, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing. And we're not doing it. We're not listening long enough to really see that. And I think that the big win for me there is empathy. You're developing such a deep empathy for the other person's situation. And where very often we're training perhaps younger financial planners to work with older clients. Their lives don't look the same. How do we display empathy when we don't look like the people we're working with? And actually, perhaps people who are more experienced are now having to develop a proposition that works for younger clients and needing to work with people again who don't look so much like them. If we can listen for longer and really be comfortable with whatever we're hearing, not express judgment, allow people to really feel heard, we're expressing empathy, we're building connection, which means that people are going to be more likely to want to work with us. So yeah, it's a long answer to a short question, but all of that it's the simple stuff that is mind-blowing when you get it right and you see the impact that it can have.
Yeah, and I was thinking, and I think Ruth has expressed it so much better than I was going to express it, but I was just thinking to myself, when I've taken the time to keep going and just push a little bit further than I might feel comfortable with questions with clients, people are so interesting. Like, you find out stuff, the hobbies and things they're into, you're looking at the person going, I never would have guessed. And that's so fascinating. So if you can go there, it just becomes even more rich. Your job becomes so much more interesting because you just find out so much more about people. It's super cool.